everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Safest Family on the Block. I'm your host, Jason, and joining me today is the inimitable Julie Fatt. Hello, Julie.
Hi, Jason. Nice to see you.
So good to see you again. Julie and I have been friends for a very long time. Julie is an expert in mental health. And why don't you go ahead and tell folks a little bit about exactly what that expertise is, what you're doing with it?
Well, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 1995, a year after my then partner, was diagnosed with bipolar. And then later I was diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, and pretty late in life, age 31. And I'd been sick since age 16. So you'd think, oh, well, I'll just take some meds. Nah, didn't happen that way. I was medication resistant. I had enormous weight gain. I'm not anti-meds. I believe in meds. But because of this, and because I saw what my then partner went through, I wrote a treatment plan that's now used all over the world. I've written 6 books on the topic. My specialty is mood disorders, which are bipolar and unipolar depression, anxiety disorders, which include phobias, general anxiety, social anxiety, and especially psychotic disorders, because in bipolar, we have all of these symptoms. And then because of this, I also had to learn about personality disorders and trauma so that we can break apart the very big difference between all of them. And that started in 1998 when I wrote my first book. And then Jason and I met because I was actually the first person to ever write, I know this seems crazy, but it's true, to ever write a self-help ebook. I was the first person to ever sell it online when we had our own Google account with our own Google AdWords expert who would call us. And it's not the same, different world now. It's before they made their billions of dollars. And so Jason and I met through my writing side and my social media and marketing side. And yet we very quickly realized that his interest in personal safety was so profound. And I'll never forget one conversation we had that changed my life. He said, if you're in a crowd and you lose your child, you get down on your knees and get to their level and you yell for them. And as I helped raise my nephew, I never forgot Jason's incredibly clear explanation of this. And then over the years, he's taught me a lot more about this topic. So I'm excited to talk to him.
I'm so glad to have you on the show. Yeah, Julie is such a badass in mental health that when my ex-wife and I were going to counseling, she was diagnosed with bipolar. The therapist we were talking to said, hey, I need you to read this book. And
I didn't know that. I didn't know that's how you.
Julie's book, Loving Someone with Bipolar Disorder.
Yep, that's it.
And in fact, she didn't even hand me the book. She handed me a photocopy of the book. But
well,
yeah,
I knew that, and we've talked about the topic very much and how much love you have and how important, it is to be in a relationship with a wife that you have children with, even if you're not together. And I was always incredibly impressed with your compassion when you ask questions about this. So I do appreciate that. I did not know that about that book. Is very popular. That's true. It was the first book ever written for partners. And now I swear, I think there's thousands of them, but it came out in 2003. Yeah.
And I think that's a really good place to kind of dig into the meat, because one of the things that you would address that very few other experts in the topic address is when you are personally neurotypical, but you have a spouse or a child or an elder who has one kind of mental diagnosis or another. Mm-hmm. And in a family safety podcast, I think that's very important. One of the first questions, just kind of a general idea, what are some of the top level things that people should keep in mind when they're find themselves in that situation?
Well, first of all, I'm a big believer in correct diagnosing. This concept that diagnosis is a label, which we say all the time in brain illness, especially in the movements that don't believe in meds, for example, it makes no sense to me. That would be like saying that diabetes is a label, or epilepsy is a label, or MS is a label, or cancer is a label. So first of all, don't be scared to go to a professional. And that doesn't mean a GP, unfortunately. You really need to go to, I like PsyDs and psychiatrists and people, psychiatric nurse practitioners, and really take in, not just a conversation, your list of symptoms. So you can do this for yourself, which requires insight. But if you're doing it for a loved one, I teach all my clients and readers, you simply make a short document of what you've observed. This means you're not violating HIPAA. You're not causing harm to anybody. It's your observations. And a really good diagnostician, which I do a lot of, and I'm not a doctor, but I was trained by my amazing co-author who was an amazing diagnostician. And I do teach this actually to healthcare professionals. But my goal is to teach everybody watching what to do to go talk to a qualified healthcare professional. So you make a list, right, of notes, and not a therapist. Therapists cannot do this. You have to go to a professional who understands this. And they'll be able to go, well, is it consistent over time? Is it not consistent over time? That's one of the first questions, because, Jason, if something is consistent over time, it can't be bipolar. Bipolar is an episodic illness. So if somebody says, no, it's not, 1 minute we were having a great time and she was happy, and then she couldn't get out of bed, and then she felt better again, and then we had kids, and then all of a sudden the symptoms got worse, and then the anger started, but then she'd be okay. I couldn't get a handle on it. Typical untreated bipolar, whereas she's never happy, he's never happy, they're never happy. They are always looking for something wrong. They have constant explosive anger. They have trouble focusing and doing things around the house, and they're having trouble in school. That's not episodic. So those kind of questions are what lead to great diagnosis. That's number one. Number two, if it's brain illness, it's not related to trauma. I cannot tell you this enough. Bipolar disorder, unipolar depression, psychotic disorders, and anxiety disorders really are, in most cases, related to the genetics of your brain, and you'll usually see them in your family. When we move to personality, which can be genetic, but personality disorders such as borderline, et cetera, which I have great compassion about, those are often considered trauma-based illness because of what happened in childhood. There's really no connection between childhood and bipolar. There's a connection between childhood adversely affecting the bipolar brain. So the next thing is you have to truly see, is there a genetic history? Did my mom, dad, grandmother, aunt, uncle, cousin, whatever, have something similar, even undiagnosed? And then was there trauma that's confusing this? And finally, focus on illness, treatment, and management versus psychology. The psychology part of it, how does it feel? Why do you act the way you do? Let's talk about this, comes after you've got a correct diagnosis and a correct way of treating the illness. So those are my three things. One, get a diagnosis. Two, separate trauma from actual brain illness. I'm not saying that trauma doesn't affect the brain greatly, but when I speak of brain illness, I'm talking about, I call them the big guys: unipolar, bipolar, schizoaffective, and schizophrenia and or psychotic disorders, and some anxiety disorders. And finally, don't try to therapy your way out of this. Get help like you with epilepsy, and then use therapy for management.
Makes sense.
That's a nutshell.
Really, I think a thing that parents need to remember or realize when it comes to diagnosis is there are parents who are afraid of getting a diagnosis.
Oh, yeah.
Especially the special ed, or what do they call it now, individual education plan label. Mm-hmm. But something to keep in mind when you're dealing with that is that your child gets 2 to 3 times the federal funding.
Unbelievable.
The second they get that label.
Yeah.
So even if
let's not call it a label. Let's say
yeah.
The second they get a correct diagnosis that allows them to access to the services they need.
Well, there's the medical diagnosis, and then there's the label given to them in the school system.
It's true that
if they get the label, hopefully through a correct diagnosis, the education resources available to your child will triple.
And when you and I were growing up, it really wasn't as good. I can tell you. How old are you, Jason? Remind me.
I'm turning 50 this year.
So I'm 58, and so we're pretty similar. And I remember, when we were kids, especially me in the 70s, there were no IEPs. People who were troubled went to different schools. So it's pretty amazing that we have put all of the groups together in an IEP. Now, one thing I should note, what you're talking about, Jason, psychiatric or I don't even like the term psychiatric anymore. I really don't like it. It's got too many connotations. Brain illness and or problems that are pediatric are phenomenally different than those that start in teen and adult. So we really do need to differentiate between pediatric concerns versus teen and adult, because by the time you're a teenager, usually 14, 15, you're socialized. Mm-hmm. So if you start your illness or anything that's going on, especially high anxiety when you're a child, the socialization process doesn't happen in the same way if you don't get help. It leads to more trouble when you're teen and adult. Whereas when I finally had my first psychotic symptoms at 16, my first mania at 17, my first severe depression at 19, I was completely socialized. So pediatric versus teen adult is also very important.
Now, is my understanding from a layman who's just read a couple of things and listened to very smart people, including yourself, there are some brain illnesses that you'll notice when your child is very young because they're basically with you their whole lives. And then there's others that have an onset later on in the teens, in the early 20s, or it's happened with my ex-wife in her mid-30s after childbirth. Could you speak to that a little bit?
So this is another reason that diagnosing from a professional is so important. And I teach a class actually called Get the Diagnosis Right. It's booked solid all of the time. And we do a brain health timeline of their, by the way, I should let you know, I never work directly like one-on-one with people with bipolar or psychotic disorders. That I send them to the healthcare professionals with my notes, but I work constantly with parents, partners, and healthcare professionals. So we do a brain timeline. I can read that timeline and literally pinpoint up age 7, something happened. But usually in my work, it's around 16, 17 by far, right? And so if you're looking for something and you've got to figure out what's going on, you look at these things. People say, Julie, how do I tell the difference between just typical child, terrible twos, or, wanting to get more independent at age 12, or just yelling and screaming like a teenager at age 14? Well, there is a big difference. And I had to figure this out. And I came up with 2 ways. Number 1, intensity. When you have a 7-year-old who's having a meltdown, or even a 2-year-old, it will not last 5 to 6 hours or into the night. They will not skip meals because of it. They will not have trouble self-soothing. You will be able eventually to talk them out of it and get them back into action. When it actually is a problem, which could be from trauma, which we always have to look at, or the brain, there's no self-soothing. The crying is intense. It's sobbing, heaving, sometimes throwing up. You cannot get them to calm down by offering them something such as a toy or even something like ice cream. And then the next thing is duration. So we look at intensity and duration. If the duration is more than a couple hours and it goes on, and it is more consistent over time, and it starts to affect school and relationships. So you've got the intensity and duration, something else is going on than the terrible twos, independence, and just being a teenager. Here's an example. 16-year-old girl, guy, them, they, doesn't matter. It's the same with everybody, has a breakup. And after this breakup, the person won't come out of their room, will not eat, is crying, is having sort of a face with no expression, doesn't want to go to school, is not having goal-driven activities, isn't talking to anybody. That is so profoundly different than someone who's just sad and gets on social media and talks about it and talks to all their friends about it and says, oh my God, I broke up. So intensity and duration, that's what you look at.
Oh, interesting. Mm-hmm. And are there certain diagnoses or certain brain illnesses that are more commonly show up later, or?
Oh yeah.
Okay. And could you talk about those a bit?
Definitely. So bipolar disorder itself, and a lot of people, they sort of read the wrong sort of numbers. The new research, which has been around for a while, is that the world population of bipolar is the same. That's what's interesting. Every country has the same amount of bipolar. It's not the same with depression, but with bipolar, it's the same. It's a genetic illness. It's about 4 to 6% of the world population. So you're looking at about 17 million people alone in the United States. And my work is international and always has been. Sometimes I even use translators, and the symptoms are always the same. Teenage adult onset bipolar has an incredibly typical pattern if it's naturally occurring. You'll start to see symptoms usually around 15, 16. There can be slight. Some people have it intensely, but usually not. By 18 or 19, boom, you're in it. And that's why so many people are diagnosed at college or at their first job or their first trip to Europe or their first boyfriend and girlfriend that's serious or their first wedding. It's often because that is the time, 19, 20, that we get really, really sick. And then you have pediatric onset, which can be any age up till about age 12. So we tend to look at puberty as being a change, but here's what's interesting. Girls' puberty is starting, I just heard, as early as 6. So we're seeing a profound change in puberty. When I was growing up, it was 12, 13, 14. We're now seeing it move down. And they think it has something to do with either stress or just the hormones in our food, or obesity, right? Which is something I deal with. And you will see onset of those illnesses pretty much anytime before 12. That's how I define pediatric. And it's the same with diabetes or pediatric epilepsy, right? But bipolar is classic 16 to 20. Anybody like your partner who was diagnosed at 30, it means that she had what's known as either a substance or sometimes a situational, like pregnancy, onset of bipolar. That's a different diagnosis because it means that her bipolar was genetically latent, and then the experience, and I would love to talk to you more. We can do this another time, but it's pretty rare for pregnancy to bring out bipolar. It's usually the medications around it or some kind of hormonal change or something that happened around it. You can have postpartum psychosis, postpartum depression, postpartum mania, but usually there's signs before. But yeah, pregnancy and the stress of it could bring out genetically latent bipolar. In schizophrenia, it's pretty similar. So you have pediatric schizophrenia, of course, very difficult, as you can imagine. And then the typical teen onset schizophrenia starts around high school. But here's what's interesting, Jason, and here's what I think is happening with so many of the violent situations that we see in the media now. The typical onset of paranoid schizophrenia is late 20s. So think about that. How hard that would be for people to catch, because the person has been pretty stable up to then, and then the conspiracy theories start. Then the thinking someone's following you start. Then somebody's filming me. Then I'm going to barricade my house. Now I have to get guns. So that's why we really have to understand this onset. Borderline and personality disorders are young. They are considered a part of the personality. So you'll see them start to come out as you start to see a child's personality. But with something like borderline, though, which is usually trauma-based, or it can be, believe it or not, something that happens in the womb, so there's a lot of research, you might not see the symptoms come out until mid-teens. So it's complicated. But yes, anybody who studies this can see the typical age of onset. All a bell curve, of course, though, you'll always have outliers.
In our situation, I can share personal stuff with my audience. With my ex-wife, she had the postpartum psychosis and then got the diagnosis. And although treatment started then, when we got the bipolar disorder diagnosis, there was a lot of,
there you go. So it was there. So that makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah.
So you got the diagnosis in her 30s, but you'll always can look back and go, yeah, she often had depression, and you always miss the hypomania. We always miss hypomania. That makes a lot more sense, because though I certainly see postpartum psychosis without question, it's pretty rare to see postpartum bipolar with no symptoms before. I'm always open to one or two people, but that explains it more. Must have been devastating, just devastating. Imagine having a child with someone and then your much loved mother gets psychotic, or your partner. Oh man, very difficult.
I think that's one of the most important things that we can talk about for the audience as well, which is, so we have this diagnosis and we've got a loved one, whether that's a partner. Actually, let's have a few different conversations. Let's start with our kid, right? One of the best metaphors that I picked up about brain illness, and I think you were the one who's put it to me in these terms, was think about it like it's a broken leg.
That's me. That was me.
Yeah, like if I broke my leg and my spouse came to me and said, "Hey, just think positive.
Go to therapy. Go to therapy."
Yeah, think positive. Do hypnotherapy and go run a triathlon.
Mm-hmm.
My partner would be being a jerk, and then because of some cultural baggage, which I think is thankfully starting to be peeled away, we don't have the same attitude about a brain disorder, about a brain illness.
It's getting a little better, but I often say this, Jason, and then I want to hear your comments on this. I love my clients and my family members I work with. They are amazing. I'm always amazing to hear how long the child has been living in the basement without leaving their room. Yeah. How long the child has been angry and violent at home, but they don't want to tell anybody, especially if it's a girl. And I say, well, if they had pneumonia, we'd be doing something. But then we have to understand, we don't live in a society that allows parents to take a depressed child and just get help, especially if they're an adult. And so if it's a broken leg, why do we never ask for a HIPAA release if someone brings in a parent with a broken leg or a child with a broken leg? And yet if it's a brain illness, oh my God, privacy, oh. So I agree with you. We need to change the system. It's changing slowly, but in the United States especially, we must talk about privacy, et cetera. But yes, we would never allow a person on the street with an obvious broken leg to stay on the street. Someone would pick them up. We will allow somebody with obvious schizophrenia on the street. It's a dichotomy.
And as a parent, I think it's, we need to show some courage about looking at those things. I mean, it's getting that news can be hard. And there's because of social factors, it can be embarrassing, unfortunately. And you mentioned something earlier about how very few mental illnesses are trauma-based. Most of them are genetic. But because of the way mental illness is often portrayed in the media, you never have a serial killer story where they don't talk about how they were beat up by their grandma or touched by an uncle. There's a part of us that feels like it must be our fault, even though most of the time the factors aren't that. So looking it squarely in the eye early and going to the doctor early, I think it's hugely important. I think it's an opportunity many parents miss.
I think this is true, but unfortunately, which is now it's everybody's fascination, but because of my work, I've been doing this for like 25 years. We love, isn't that a weird, I was about to say we love to hear about serial killers, but that's the truth. But if you study psychopathy, right, which is sociopath, and it's then the form of psychopath, there are now, it's unbelievable research using what's called an fMRI, which is a functional MRI where people do tasks to see the changes in the brain of known psychopaths is unbelievable. It is so obvious. There's books, you can go look it up. But here's the question. There's two schools of thought. Often when you do look at people who act out, they did have a violent childhood. There's no question about it. But then so did their siblings who never go to kill. So this is a very complex question. But then we're not talking about bipolar or schizophrenia there. If you have a serial killer who has schizophrenia, such as Richard Chase, who killed people in order to get their blood, to drink their blood, because he had psychotic somatic delusion that he had no blood. Everybody says this is literally, that's schizophrenia, he's got to get help. Kip Kinkle, all of these people, that obvious schizophrenia, right? But the others, Ted Bundy, et cetera, it's complex. But we really are now seeing that either something happened to their brain when they were younger, or they were born with a brain that predisposes them to the lack of empathy and the enjoyment of these thrill-seeking behaviors that lead to the killings. And by the way, and I will say this, most people who are psychopaths do not kill. I mean, that's a thing, but they can be very violent, and they're the highest amount of people who are in jail. But it's a good thing. So that's why I sort of don't use the word mental illness anymore. Mental implies so much psychology. So I think it's fine to say mental health when we're talking about when we're talking about situational depression, situational anxiety, borderline, those kind of things. That's about mental health. For me, I use brain illness now, and that's when you're talking about the genetic illnesses. So it might help to say mental health is lifestyle changes, childhood trauma. But when we get into brain illness, like what I have, it's just like epilepsy. You're born with it.
Makes sense. So kind of going back to that leg metaphor, say, you got your 19-year-old son who had an IED problem when he was in the Marines and came home with the lower half of a leg gone, or you have a smaller child in an auto accident, same situation. There's the injury or illness for the mental situations, which literally prevent certain things and makes a lot of other things harder. And then there's the lifestyle, mental health things about our attitude about it, how we treat them. And again, I can see a family where a child's injured, where there's very little support, where the parents, maybe the parent was behind the wheel and the guilt's preventing them from addressing it head on. Where with brain illness, have the same thing, where you have this injury, this illness, and then separate from that is the support that we can have for them and the ways that we can make the home supportive, ways that we can reach out to the schools to be supportive, ways that we can have the conversations. and also ways that we can encourage them to push the envelope of what they're capable of as they begin to deal with and get a handle on the illness without putting on undue pressure. And I think that's a hugely important thing to internalize and understand and act on as a loving parent. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I call this the tangled ball of string when I work with families. If you, as a parent or a partner especially, or a child who's helping a parent or anybody, any caregiver, don't first parse out the actual brain changes that happen in a traumatic event, it's going to be very hard to talk to them about anything else, because anything that impacts the brain. I have a head injury as well. I didn't even mention that, but it's one of my biggest problems I have from a biking accident. If we don't physically address that through, in PTSD, actually, there is a lot of work. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it was written by the original VA doctor who came up with the concept of PTSD. And if we don't address that first, it's going to be very hard to have relationships and move forward. So take that tangled ball of string and start thinking, all right, I've got 50 different strings and they're all tangled. I want them to go in channels. Channel one is, I've got to look at what happened and see if there's a head injury when I had that accident. So we're using the leg injury metaphor, either from an explodable device or from a car accident. I've got to see if there's some kind of head injury. I have to see if there are actual symptoms of PTSD can be fixed. I have to see then if there's depression, because, oh my God, you just lost your leg. I have to see society-wise how it impacts them. Were you a very active person before, or were you a marathon runner, or were you on your track team when you lost your leg? I have to look at their...
The difference, if a child loses a leg in an auto accident, the difference between somebody who's into computers and video games versus...
Absolutely, it's so enormous. It's so enormous.
Who just lost scholarship, you know?
Right. Huge. And so if parents, no matter what they're looking at, because we've gone from talking about, you know, somebody who has a psychotic disorder, somebody who's lost a leg versus somebody who is in war, for example, look at it as, I'm going to figure this out by putting things sort of in channels. You cannot, I know we have to treat the whole person, but to treat the whole person means you have to figure out actually what's going on, which didn't happen with me. I was treated for literally depression and being a little bit wild. And the whole time it was bipolar disorder with mania and psychosis. Missed, completely missed. Wouldn't be missed now. It was missed 30 years ago, okay? And then look at the whole person, look at them, and don't just try, I sound a little emphatic here, but some people like to talk about their feelings, others don't. Don't make somebody who doesn't like to talk about their feelings go sit with a therapist. Instead, put them in a group that's behavior oriented, that maybe involves animals, that involves occupational therapy. Now, here's the big question, Jason. Where do people get all the money and time to do this?
Unfortunately, in the US, you're out of luck.
When you have a beloved child, partner, whatever, they were in the military, and even the VA is enormously troubled right now with the amount of thing. So if you don't have the money or the time, and I don't mean time, you want to give this time, but let's say you have to work. I can't begin to tell you how many professionally run groups there are like mine. They're all done in private, by the way. They're never done in public. You have to make sure that you really check, that you make sure you've got credentials like you have, right, with your background. That's where you go, and you go look for support, and you go there, and they'll let you know the places that are not too expensive. They'll let you know what works and doesn't work. And if they're good, they'll never tell you what to do. They'll simply give you access to what could help. And we just look at this complicated topic. But I agree with you. We have to address head on the impact of anything that affects the brain, because it's the brain that controls everything. And I'll give you one example. I work with a lot of families, and they all want it to be bipolar when it's not. And when I have to say, I'm sorry, but in my experience and the charts that we've gotten and all the people you've talked to and the professionals we're working with, your child has schizophrenia. Can you imagine, Jason, that you would prefer to have bipolar, which is a terrible, difficult illness, believe me, because the word schizophrenia is so scary. And you would be surprised how many people who have either bipolar or a psychotic disorder want it to be PTSD. So they'll tell their doctor it's PTSD, even though there was no event. So this is complex. That's why I can't give you an exact answer to what you do. Instead, let's talk process that finds answers. That's what makes sense. And find a coach like yourself who's professional. You don't have to start with the doctor. They will put you with the right healthcare professionals. I highly recommend coaches.
And you've mentioned coaches and groups and support groups. What are some of the best resources that we can find? What are the best ways to get in touch with those?
It depends on what you're looking for. So here's what you do. It's so easy to find them now, right? First of all, let's talk about what is required to run a really good support group. First of all, the person running the group needs to have experience in what they're doing, but cannot be experiencing what they're doing. It is not safe for someone with bipolar disorder to run a support group who still has active, unmanaged bipolar symptoms. This happens all the time. That's why it's not safe. It is not safe for somebody to act like a therapist or give advice that then doesn't go to a healthcare professional. So simply look up their qualifications. Now, people who get mad at me will say, "Who are you? You're not a doctor." And I'll say, "Well, I'm fully willing to discuss my 25 years of training and the fact that I am a continuing education trainer for healthcare professionals, including doctors, social workers, etc. But I don't want to be a doctor. And the reason I don't have my PhD is because I'm not well enough to do 5 years of school. I have a lot of brain illness, right?" And so you can find people who are absolutely will tell you what their experience is. Then go to the group and look and see how they're giving advice. If they're saying, "Well, you should do this and you should do that, and this sounds like this," be very careful. But if they're saying, "Here's an organization that can help. Here's another person who's been through what you've been through can help." And that's what you look for. And you know where most of these are? They are private groups on Facebook. So search Facebook for private groups. They always will have a monitoring, like my groups are private. I have a group for partners called the Stable Bed, a group for everybody else called the Stable Table. You don't get in there unless you tell me who you are, and I monitor every comment. I answer almost 1,000 comments a month. So you really have to look at the person, and then you'll get the feeling. And they will never be upset by real questions. And that's what I suggest. And so there's autism groups, there are bipolar groups, there's schizophrenia groups, there's parent groups. If the comments are not moderated and it's just people literally telling their problems, don't go there. You won't get the help you need. You can use those if you're using them just to vent. But if you're actually looking for help, the moderator will be very careful about the comments they allow. And that's what I suggest. There are also fabulous groups that have pages on Instagram on a place called the Clubhouse, for example, which has it's an app that has great groups. And a lot of people do free live events, including psychiatrists, therapists, PTSD specialists. They're all on Instagram now. And they all do free talks all the time. So there's so much info now. There's so much info. It's fabulous.
So if, for example, I get the diagnosis from psychiatrist, pediatric psychiatrist, that my teenager started to show has schizophrenia. I could go into Facebook and do a search for schizophrenia support, Portland, Oregon, and a bunch of groups would show up. And then I could look.
And you can even, in fact, you can even be a little more specific. Schizophrenia parent support group. Schizophrenia partner support group, schizophrenia parent of teen with schizophrenia diagnosis. The research, it's astonishing what's out there. I can't even keep up with the need, to be honest. And so that's why I'm moving a lot of my stuff. I'm even moving out of books and more into video series, but as a person with all these brain illnesses, I have to be careful. It takes me a long time to work, right? But the need, Jason, is so huge. And we've added something new, which is scary. And you and I talked about this before, and that's the legalization of cannabis marijuana. I am not against weed. I smoked so much weed in the 80s, you don't have any idea. But what we have out now, which is what we call industrial level, has a THC that's not being regulated. And unfortunately, it's creating psychotic episodes that are so new that we're not used to, that people who have bipolar who are using it are being moved into the schizoaffective, which means bipolar with a psychotic disorder. And people who have schizophrenia genes, for example, in the family, who are using this high THC weed are having just sort of an explosion of psychosis that's been then being diagnosed as schizophrenia. It's very important to note, weed does not cause mental illness or brain illness. Let's use that term. It doesn't. Does it make it worse? And can it make latent, genetic, non-expressed serious mental illness, brain illness come out? Yes. But we have a confusing time right now. So one of my best advice is, if your loved one, any age, is having psychosis and has been diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar, schizoaffective, anything, you must be honest about their cannabis use and talk to the healthcare professionals. I've been talking about this for over 10 years and people didn't want to hear it. Now I'm starting to see people are a little more open. It basically changed my business. 99% of the people who come to me now have a loved one who's gotten sick from high THC marijuana. 99%. Whereas before it was legalized, it was almost zero.
That's especially dangerous right now because a lot of people with undiagnosed brain illnesses self-medicate with marijuana.
Wouldn't you? If, you know, you and I are marketers. You and I, we met because I used to teach book marketing and social media marketing and, you know, conferences. When I look at the way that legalized marijuana was allowed to market itself and allowed to put literally almost 20 miracle cures with no FDA approval. Remember, this is a state-run thing. There's no FDA approval, no testing, and very little research. Just today, I saw that there's organizations now that are getting busted, for example, for saying that Delta 8, which is the THC pulled out of hemp, has all kind of health. They've busted them. So I think in the next 10 years, we will see regulation. We're never going to stop the legalization. It's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. But we must have real testing, because when I got psychotic from weed, in 2012, which is when I had my bike accident, I thought I was getting the stuff from the 80s and it was going to help calm. Oh my God, Jason, I had the worst psychotic episode of my entire bipolar life, because the weed that said 4 to 6% THC, that would have been typical Cheech and Chong weed of the 80s. No, it was 15 to 18%. When I got the 25% weed, holy man, almost put me in the hospital. And that's when I had to change. I had to educate myself because I wasn't anti-marijuana, and I'm still not. But it is the biggest problem in our brain illness community today.
Yeah, we need to be aware, especially as
aware.
Look at it.
Listen, we're both from Portland, right? Do you know how many of my friends of mine who are stable people have gotten sick or have had to go to the hospital because of these gummies? Because they thought, oh, I'll just take a gummy, and they eat the whole thing, or getting something that you're really supposed to take a bite of. Oh my God, stomach pumps, charcoal. Being vertigo in the bed, thinking that they were dying. That's stable people. Imagine if it gets into a brain like mine. Oh man. So I call myself like cannabis educator. I'm a cannabis educator. Right.
Well, it's very much like expecting Bud Light and instead having a glass of Everclear.
Well, that's what the Ozzy Osbourne quote that's the best. This new weed is like walking into a bar and ordering a beer, and they put 7 shots of vodka in it and don't tell you. And if somebody who loved drugs like Ozzy did, or someone like me who literally was a pothead in the 80s, this is dangerous stuff. We need to be careful.
And I like that you're not approaching it from a moral standpoint. There's nothing.
I never had. Oh my God, me.
Right?
That's the least moral. I did though. I have to say, when I started writing about this, which you'll notice, you're not going to see me write about this online very much, because the people who love their weed, who think that I'm trying to take it away from them, will try and shut down my websites. That's why you don't see me putting articles out about it. I do it all in private, because just the vitriol around this, they don't want to hear. I'm not saying you can't have weed. I'm saying if you have bipolar, you really can't use this THC. It's too strong. So I've had to temper myself, because my first article ever, what is this? The new psychotic pot, which was around 2013. Oh man, nobody liked it. Nobody liked it. So I had to calm myself down a little bit. What is this?
So here's a question for parents who maybe there's been a new diagnosis and they've got the correct diagnosis. And when I give advice on the various topics that I speak on, I often come to it from the standpoint of, okay, here's the mistakes I've made. You can avoid those and go on to make unique and exciting mistakes of your own.
Love that.
What are the big mistakes that you see parents making when they receive that diagnosis and are starting to move forward? What are the big mistakes that we should avoid?
So if we're talking about unipolar, bipolar, those are your mood disorders that are genetic. If we're talking about severe anxiety with no trauma that is debilitating, like can't go to school. If we are talking about incredibly obvious psychotic symptoms, such as thinking there's a camera, whatever, there's two big mistakes. One, thinking meds are the answer, and two, thinking you can do it without meds. And I know that sounds contradictory, but here's the reality. Meds are about 50% of dealing with any of these serious brain disorders, which we call SMI, serious mental illness, or SPMI, serious persistent mental illness. We are all working towards calling it brain illness instead, but anyway. And so we often say brain disorder. Those are your non-trauma based, non-drug based, naturally occurring serious brain illnesses, and you will notice them. That's why you took the child to the doctor. Do not pump that child with meds. Meds go hand in hand with lifestyle and behavior changes after a really good diagnosis and a plan is in place. I am fully believer in meds. But at the same time, to think that you can manage something this serious without meds would be like managing epilepsy or diabetes mellitus, which is non-insulin producing pancreas, without meds. Absolutely not. So we meet in the middle. Sleep is the number one natural treatment for all of these disorders because they all disrupt sleep. 2, calm family life. You have to look at what's happening in family. School system that understands their needs and the ability to have sort of the stable environment. Now, do you sometimes have to go to the hospital first or even a treatment facility? Sure. Will you use meds there? Absolutely, because we have to bring down an intense episode. But me, for example, and I know I'm an exception because I am willing to do this, but I manage 75 at least % of my symptoms on my own. And then for the 25 around that I can't treat on my own, I use my lithium, I use sleep meds, and I use a wide variety of things. So it's not all meds and it's not no meds, doesn't exist. Let's look at diabetes mellitus. You are going to have to take insulin, but if you eat chocolate cake all day, you can't keep pumping up that insulin. That's lifestyle. Here's some exciting news that's coming out, Jason. The ketogenic diet, which everybody talks about now, actually was created for childhood epilepsy. And it worked extremely, extremely well. And then it fell out of favor when we started using what we call the anti-epilepsy medications, Depakote, Tegretol, Lamictal. And we moved from the phenobarbital and moved to those drugs. People had good response, but some kids didn't. In the 1990s, the diet was sort of rediscovered. And now Johns Hopkins and a place called the Charlie Foundation has an entire ketogenic epilepsy wing for kids who are either medication resistant or the meds make them really sick to use the ketogenic diet for epilepsy. My research in the last 2 years has been using this diet in bipolar and psychotic disorders. And first thing to know, this is not the keto diet you're seeing on Instagram and TikTok. That's called the Atkins. That's a modified form of the diet that's very high protein. You'll notice there's lots of meat. In the ketogenic diet I highly recommend people looking this up. It is using a high fat content diet to manage GABA, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, acetylcholine in the brain, and it works. It mimics these epilepsy medications. And guess what meds are used for bipolar? Epilepsy meds. In schizophrenia, it's thought to help, though it's hard to get people to follow it, of course, because it is a dopamine changing illness. I've been researching it for 2 years, and here's what I find interesting. I don't tolerate it very well, but I don't tolerate psych meds. So that tells me, I think it is mimicking what the psych meds do. It's giving me side effects. So I now work with a ketogenic nutritional specialist. This is not for weight loss, but it is also for medication side effects. So if people are interested, they should look up ketogenic metabolic therapy for epilepsy and read about that. Not just for bipolar, because a lot of people still don't know how to use it. Do not look at what's on Instagram. There's nothing wrong with that. People can be quite healthy. But So it's not only meds, no meds, high meds. It can be in between, and we can look at this ketogenic diet. Interesting to know, regular diet changes, just a healthy diet, no impact on bipolar mania or psychosis. So isn't it interesting that it's only when you do calories, because I know you're interested in nutrition, that's why and so many of your followers, only when you learn the ratio of the fat to the protein and the carb to have a metabolic change in the brain chemistry, which actually is affecting insulin, of course, which is why these diets are used in diabetes as well. Can you see the change? And you have to work with a nutritionist. And I very gladly, if people are interested, you can write you or me. I will send you the links to the people who are doing the research all over the world using this for brain disorders. It's new research.
And so one of the things I'm noticing there is that there's the symptoms and there's the diagnosis, but there's diet, there's sleep, there's home life, there's school life,
it's everything. Yeah.
I like the point about, meds aren't the solution, but they're not unimportant. Again, getting back to the leg thing, if I break my ACL in a motorcycle accident, they're not going to give me Vicodin and slap me on the butt and send me on the way. They're going to give me Vicodin, and I'm going to go to PT.
Then you're going to go to PT. Exactly. And if
right?
you look at, and they might do surgery. Yeah. People write me, most of my work is done in private, but if people want to see me really interacting with people with bipolar and psychotic disorders, that's what I do on Instagram. That's the only place that I actually work directly, but you wouldn't believe the messages I get in direct message. People are so honest. And I always encourage men to write me. And it's amazing what they will tell me. They're very worried, and you'll never see it on their Instagram page. And I try not actually to look at names or look at people's Instagram pages when they write me, because I don't want to see what they're presenting to the world. I want to see what they're showing me when they write me. So I literally just treat them as a person when they come in. But there's a lot of people suffering out there, Jason, and they think, I don't want to be drugged by these meds. And I said, well, what about learning a way to manage your symptoms? Because you're coming to me, so you know you're sick. And then only using meds for the ones you can't do on your own. And that means less side effects. For example, now I'm not telling people to do this because it's hard, but I use lithium as needed. And most people say, what? You don't have to be on lithium the rest of your life. I'm like, I can't tolerate it. But if I can't manage my mania using all of my natural things, and by natural, I do not mean supplements, those can make us sick as well. I mean, sleep, exercise, light, all of this kind of stuff, relationships, travel, whatever. If I can't do that, then I'll take my lithium. Does it make me fatter? Absolutely. Does it make me thirsty? Yes. Does it piss me off I have to take it? Yes. But I'd rather use it as needed and really sort of change my life overall so I have less symptoms than be sick all the time. So this is a discussion we need to have. I'm glad you're really asking this, because people are willing to take meds, but they're not willing to live with those side effects. And that's the main problem we have.
And then finding, especially, I know a number of adults who have bipolar disorder, who the meds even them out, they feel so foggy, and
you can't even, the fact that, and once again, I really support and believe in good healthcare professionals. I work with them all the time. I'm my co-author. I mean, I write books with them. They're the most important people in my life and have been, but there's a lot of not good ones. And there's a lot who don't have time. So you'll get a diagnosis and a bag of medications. And some of them will hand out my books, which help, because I wrote the main management book on bipolar. It's called Take Charge of Bipolar Disorder. It was the first book to ever talk about triggers. It blows my mind that it wasn't until I wrote that book for an illness that's 3,000 years old that nobody taught me that if I have a fight with somebody that my bipolar is going to get worse. Nobody. And eventually I worked with amazing psychiatrists who did teach me some of this stuff. So it just depends. But yeah, who you talk to is very, very important. But no, it does not have to be all meds. So what I would say to your friends is, okay, you've gotten more stable on those meds. So now what can you change in your life and I'm not telling them to do this, I'm telling them to work with your doctor. What can you do to reduce everything that's possibly causing more symptoms so you can reduce your meds? Everybody can do this, but it's hard work. And Jason, you can't do drugs. You can't drink a lot. you can't party, and you have to sleep usually by midnight. So sometimes it's just a maturity thing. You know, I was a heavy partier before I was diagnosed. There's no way I could do it now. I'd be sick all the time. I'd have to take my lithium all the time. So when somebody's ready to say, I choose stability over the chaos that partying brings, there's a little bit, I have empathy. There's a little bit of change that can happen, and you absolutely can use less meds.
And that gets back, I think, to sounds like one of the best things that a parent can do to support a child that has a diagnosis and has a brain illness is to create that context of making it easy to get to bed on time, making sure that the diet is healthy, maybe fine tune it as a way in lieu of medication, but at the very least make sure that it's not pizza and soda 3 times a day.
Jason, I'm going to have to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Don't see any difference in bipolar between eating pizza and soda and eating healthy. There is no research. There is no research to show that eating pizza and cake and candy and ice cream actually makes bipolar significantly worse. Now, here's what's interesting about research, right?
Yeah.
Could stopping that make bipolar better in combination with some other stuff? Of course it could. But there is some thought about insulin resistance. There's some thought if you're eating pizza and soda, it's going to affect your insulin. But this is what's interesting about that ketogenic diet research. It's only when you stop all of that and increase the natural fat in ratio to protein and carb that you see true management of the illness. Nobody's going to get better eating pizza, Coke, partying, doing drugs, whatever, because I lived that life. We're not going to get better. But to think that parents can change their child's diet or just the sleep that's management versus treatment. So I'm glad you said this, because actually what a parent has to do first, without question, is if this is your naturally born child that's just been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, you have a family member with bipolar. And you have to do some background. Now, sometimes people don't know. It took me years to find my link. It was a grandfather I never met. And then one day I meet his unknown daughter that was my dad's half-sister. We didn't know, wonderful woman. She starts to tell me about him. And Jason, it was one of the most shocking moments of my life. She was describing a man with untreated bipolar disorder. And I remember sitting there, it overwhelmed me. It overwhelmed me to the point that I didn't even ask her the questions I needed to. And then I saw it manifest in my dad and other family members in a way that probably like you saw in your wife, but it wasn't serious enough till she had her pregnancy. I went, oh my God, it's in my family, 4 generations. And so that's really where we start. What meds do I need to calm it down to the point that I can focus on sleep and more healthy diet? And some of the supplements like B vitamins that can help. But the emphasis on diet and exercise, the research really shows that that's phenomenally helpful in situational depression and anxiety. We don't see it harming bipolar or psychotic disorders. No way. Does it help some? Absolutely. But if you want to use it as actual treatment and ultimately use it as management, you have to do it so much. So for example, a 3-hour walk can give you a longer term effects than 20 minutes of exercise in serious bipolar depression. And I know people wish that there were a natural way, like if I just change my diet, if I change my sleep, if I do all of this, to just not ever have to take meds or ever have to address it seriously. Do those things help? Absolutely. But without a medical regime or being ready for big triggers, such as the death of a loved one, that's not going to be enough. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
That parents can go there eventually. And by the way, sleep is so interesting, and circadian rhythm is where we're looking at. Bipolar is a circadian rhythm illness. So if you study circadian rhythm, the best goal, go to bed on the same day you woke up. That actually can profoundly prevent bipolar episodes and help sort of treat those that appear, but it's not going to be enough. So that's why I want to be clear that this is a big process of many things that then work together to manage bipolar. But if somebody cannot do all the changes, meds are by far the number one treatment.
Seems like there's two things. There's the treatment, which is the meds, the fine tuning of the diet, the therapy, what have you. But there's also just baseline lifestyle. For example, apparently
Got it right.
the research doesn't say that if you eat like crap, that affects the bipolar. On the other hand, if you eat like crap, you're not sleeping well, and you have a chaotic home environment, you feel like crap when you're neurotypical. If you eat like crap and you sleep like crap and your home environment's crap and you got bipolar, you feel like crap and you have bipolar.
You're going to have mood swings. Yeah. And that's, you know, Jason, you're one of the first who's really sort of said this, because this is what I teach. There is a profound difference between treatment and management. And believe it or not, talk therapy is never a treatment for serious brain illness. It doesn't work. Talk therapy is after a person has said, I have this illness, I need some support in dealing with the fact that I have this illness. What does work is behavioral therapy. And there's very few behavioral therapists, actually. There's not a lot. And that's a person a therapist who will look for signs of depression or mania and say, hey, I can tell that things seem to be going really well, but you know what? We've got to examine your sleep right now to see if this is actually mania. That's behavioral therapy. A talk therapist, which is why I never recommend talk therapy for bipolar, ever. I love talk therapy, but not for bipolar. Will say, wow, it seems like things are going really well. Isn't it great that depression is gone? And will literally encourage mania. So yes, treatment, doctors, hospitals, treatment facilities, medications, behavioral therapy, which is intense, also can include DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, but that requires insight. Then you have management, talk therapy, support groups, friends, family, books, whatever. Profoundly different. Because most people, when diagnosed with bipolar, like your wife was, your ex, were in a crisis. Got to do treatment first, then we move to manage it.
And also this dovetails with one of our earlier guests, Karen Lutofsky, who is one of Canada's foremost experts on suicide prevention.
Oh, what a topic.
As parents, we can help with the management. In fact, we may have to take point on the management for a while, especially with younger kids, but we're not qualified to do the therapy. What we need to do is find an expert and listen carefully.
Yeah. But I
guess the treatment.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I'm so passionate about this, right? And I love it. I just love the topics that you talk about. And I love it that, when we first met, we talked about safety, like if you're in a foreign country, or if you lose your child, if your child is abducted, whatever. And you've moved this into include all of this brain illness, because keeping children safe, as we see a lot in the news, right, really does mean looking in their brains and seeing what's happening. What I teach, which is very different than most people, is if you have bipolar in your family tree, there's an extremely good chance you're going to have suicidal thoughts, period. So I help raise my cool, amazing, normal, regular kid nephew, right? And by normal, what I mean is that he's nothing abnormally exceptional. I'm not saying he's a genius. I don't want to say that he's amazing more than other kids. He's a really great kid. He's like your kids. He's just good kid. We started talking about the brain at age 2. By age 6, he understood. He couldn't really manifest what I was teaching yet. By age 6, we were talking about depression, how if you skin your knee, you talk about it, how if your brain hurts, you talk about it. By age around 9, I was introducing the concept of mania, the concept of anxiety, hadn't started with psychosis yet. At age 11, something amazing happened. I had a big speaking gig in California. I had to fly from Oregon. I always have panic attacks. That's just part of it. It's part of my illness. And I was in the living room breathing. I was having a panic attack. He goes, hold on, Auntie Wee. He went into the bathroom, got a warm towel, put lavender on it, came back to the living room, put it on my forehead and said, when we're anxious, we breathe. And right there, I knew it had worked. It took from age 2 to 12 for it to manifest. Now, at age 20, I interviewed him for my next book. He told me what it was like to learn this process. By age 12, easily, we were talking about suicidal thoughts, what they sound like, what they look like. He has bipolar, serious bipolar, and depression and anxiety on the other side. I better talk to him openly about this. And he told me that he definitely has depression. He told me that he remembered this when he was very worried and couldn't get out of bed, etc. And so if you have any history of anybody genetically committing, I don't say that anymore, I won't say that, who dies by depression or dies by the illness, which is what we call suicide, you have to talk to your kids. And here's what I say. Did you know it's absolutely normal to have a thought that you don't want to be here? That's part of the human condition. It's been talked about through life. When we have a thought such as, I wish I were dead, or I don't want to be here, we have to tell others, we do not have to be scared, and we have to realize that that's our brain chemicals not working. Now, you have to be very, very careful of when you approach this. But the fact, for example, that my ex had his first suicidal thought at age 4. His dad has bipolar and he has bipolar. We have to be careful about when we talk about it. But I love what she's saying. Yes. And then if we've had these discussions, we do have to go get professional help for it. But we do not have to call all of our suicidal thoughts being suicidal.
Yeah.
They are a totally natural symptom of bipolar depression or bipolar dysphoric mania, or in schizophrenia with people who have the depression with it, or with some serious anxiety. Absolutely normal. And you either have the thought, which is the passive, I wish I were dead, I wish I'd get cancer and die, I wish somebody would kill me so I didn't feel so bad, versus the active, I'm going to take pills, etc. And I talked to David about it, and here's the beautiful thing, Jason. He helped 3 young men in his high school get help for brain illness. 3 of them. He brought them to me. He talked about my books. We then worked with their parents, and they went into treatment. I believe he saved 3 lives. Yeah. And so what you're doing is so important, because let's not be scared of talking about suicide. It's no different than having a broken leg. In fact, it is more common for someone with bipolar to have suicidal thoughts than it is to have a broken leg.
Yeah.
And I'm suicidal all the time. So stress is what leads to my suicidal thoughts. And here's what I do. Oh man, not again. I better check on what's happening. I'm suicidal. And I have really bizarre ones. I wish a plane would fly over me and a bomb would drop and blow me up. And when I was younger, I had no idea what that meant. They started at 19. Now I'm like, oh crap, I'm stressed. So let's not, that's one thing I don't know if you watch, but you know, with the Judd family, who are country singers in the United States, right? I watched them address the death of their mother, Naomi Judd, by suicidal thoughts. And I loved what they put out. Our mother died by the devastation that is serious mental illness, because that's what it is. Why do we have to know that someone died by suicide? Why is that anybody's business? We don't have to say somebody died by a myofractal or glioblastoma. We usually just say, oh, they died of cancer. We don't have to say they died of a tumor on this part of the brain that did. We don't have to say that somebody died by suicide. When did we get to this point that we have to broadcast that? It's no different than dying from cancer. And so anyway, I could go, I know my answers get really long because I'm so passionate, because you're asking such great questions. And I love the way you think. We have to change the way we think about all of this. So not only do we have to do that because there's not enough treatment for it, we have to do that because much of the treatment is actually not very effective, such as sending someone with bipolar to just basic talk therapy. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
One of the things that came from that for me was folks who watched the show for a long time, 2 years ago, heard me bragging about my, at the time, 10-year-old, who was the only adult in a room where somebody died who could figure out how to call 911 because all the other parents were panicking and fumbling with their phones. He picks up the phone and says, "Hey Siri, call 911."
You trained him.
Right. And next year I had a fairly serious leg laceration, but my oldest kid had a compress on me and a Coban wrap around it before I was done using the F word. I wish that I had trained them up just as effectively for dealing with mental health issues.
But you're doing it now, Jason.
Yeah. And now
we can look back. Oh my God, don't I wish that in 1982, when I was flunking out of college and they put me in a group therapy and somebody said I just needed to get my act together, don't I wish that were different? School therapist. I once had a therapist in Japan when I was really manic tell me that I wasn't a good Christian. So, I mean, I can look, my parents have regrets like you wouldn't believe. My ex-husband, my first husband, whom I left when I was manic. Oh my God. So the fact that you're doing it now is the only thing that matters. Kids don't care of what you didn't do as long as you've changed. I believe that with all of my heart. If you truly mean it and listen to them and change and say, I would have done this differently, kids don't tend to hold a grudge.
Yeah.
I'd like to tell you a quick story.
Absolutely.
So I helped raise my amazing nephew, David, whom, you know, and I know I've met your kids, so I know how great they are too, right? But you know how we love our kids. I never wanted to be a parent until I met David. Now I understand why people are parents. Oh my gosh, it was amazing. Great kid. So I didn't know that I was having a type of mania that's called dysphoric mania. And this is agitated, aggressive, often violent mania. Because I hadn't had it a lot. I mostly had the more euphoric, which is a little out of control, happiness. And I had a lot of road rage with it. This was a long time ago, so please know this, almost 15 years ago. And one day I knew I was manic and I was trying to be careful. Well, someone flipped me off. Well, I chased him in my car. And I mean, chased him. And Jason, I looked in the rear view mirror and saw my nephew. I'd forgotten he was there. He was 6. I have talked to him about it. He laughs because he says he has no memory. Nothing happened because I stopped my car. That was one of the most embarrassing, awful, scary, horrific things that ever happened to me. I chased somebody down to harm them while my 6-year-old nephew was strapped safely in a car seat. I forgot about him. That's how powerful mania is. From that day forward, I made it my life's work to focus on mania management more than depression management. Everybody focuses on depression. I realized that I was allowing quite a bit of my mania. I liked it. Never again. And also, and I write about this a lot, I am celibate if I am not in a relationship, because manic hypersexuality just sort of destroyed things for me. So we need to talk about the bad things, which is scary, but also say, you know what? I don't do that anymore. I have to let that go. Even now talking about it, I feel like I have like a pressure on my chest because I'm so disgusted with myself and I'm so ashamed, but he doesn't care. And everybody else is sort of like, wow, that's incredible. But I learned, you learned, parents who learn, partners who learn, that's all we can ask. That's it.
I think, you know, if viewers get one thing from this conversation, it's that taking away the guilt, the shame, whether you're feeling it yourself or whether you're inflicting it on your loved one, that has been wrapped up with mental illness for so long, and that
for so long. Oh my God.
To diabetes or a broken leg or being born with half of an arm, cerebral, like that.
Well, and how about the people who are watching, Jason, who maybe were undiagnosed later, and it impacted their kids and it impacted their substance use. And now they're feeling better and they're like, oh my God, what have I done? Well, what you have to do is you have to say, I didn't know what I was doing. I take responsibility for it fully. I take responsibility for chasing somebody in my car, but I honestly did not do that consciously because mania turns off your frontal lobes. But was it my responsibility to never put my nephew in danger again? Absolutely. I changed from that moment, but it took something that serious. I was in my 40s and I'd managed everything else, but I liked a little bit of mania, you know, it gives you lots of energy. Never. So I love your compassion.
Oh,
I think it's important.
thank you. So Julie, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
We can talk forever.
Tell folks about where they can find.
Excuse me?
Could you tell folks where they can find you?
Well, I think the best place, since I'm redoing my webpage, is you can go to my webpage, juliefast.com, and you'll see all the television work and my background and all my interviews and my books. And that's a great place to go. But if you really want information, just type in my name, like Julie Fast Psychosis, Julie Fast Mania, Julie Fast Research. I do research on mania in the eyes, so I'm big on, that's one of my big researches. I do a lot. You can type in Julie Fast Cannabis and find some stuff about me. If you want to really see my daily work, go to Julie Fast on Instagram. And I try to keep that page small because I answer all of my direct messages. So I don't get caught up in the I need lots of followers kind of thing. That's something I think is really important for us to teach our kids as well. And then if you are a parent with bipolar child, loved one. I don't like to say that, bipolar child with bipolar, etc. You can join me on the Stable Table on Facebook. And if you're a partner, the Stable Bed. Otherwise, just type in my name. There's thousands of things online.
Excellent.
Jason,
Well,
you are
Julie,
a great interviewer. You're
well, thank
great.
you. I do my best.
You do a good job, good listener and great interviewer. Thank you. And I always have to say this because I have to calm myself because I talk a lot. It's done out of passion, not disrespect.
And folks, Julie is extremely giving. If you reach out to her, she will.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm here.
Well, thank you again, Julie. Thank you everybody for watching.
Jason.
We'll see you all next time. Be safe.